I'm Sarah Chen, a detective who dedicated 15 years of my life to the city. And yet the new chief of police, Maxwell Thorne, shoved my termination papers in my face with nothing more than an arrogant smirk. He thought I was just a nameless number, easily crushed and replaced. But he never knew that in the contract he didn't bother to read, I had planted a time bomb years ago. Section 7.4. That clause tied my name to 2 top-secret investigations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, cases that would completely collapse without me. He thought he was signing my termination papers. In reality, he signed the death warrant for his own career. That's what the new chief of police, Maxwell Thorne, had practically purred at Detective Sarah Chen the day he signed her termination papers. He'd leaned back in his plush leather chair, a man who believed arrogance was a strategy, not a flaw. His uniform impeccably pressed, his grin too rehearsed, a predator who'd never missed a promotion, let alone a monthly quota. Around him, the office had seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to a power play. He didn't even look at her when he slid the document across the polished oak desk. His gaze was fixed on the sprawling city skyline outside his panoramic window, as if the metropolis itself was applauding his ruthless efficiency. Sarah didn't say a word. Not when his smirk deepened. Not when he condescendingly suggested she be grateful for the severance package. And certainly not when he dismissed 15 years of unwavering dedication, countless sleepless nights, and a track record of undeniable results with a mere flick of his wrist. He mistook her silence for surrender. What he failed to grasp was that silence, for some, is merely the prelude to calculation. 10 minutes later, she found herself in the cold, sterile glass box of HR, a packet shoved towards her like a belated birthday card. Severance figures, stark and unfeeling, were printed in polite black ink. 2 burly security guards, Officer Jenkins and Officer Dale, loitered just outside the door, their presence a not-so-subtle reminder of the thief they believed she was. Jenkins, a rookie Sarah had once mentored, averted his eyes, a flicker of shame on his young face. Dale, a veteran known for his unwavering loyalty to whoever held power, offered a curt, unfeeling nod. Her badge, a symbol of her identity for so long, blinked an ominous red before she'd even signed the final page. They handed her a standard-issue tote bag, emblazoned with the department's crest, as if this piece of corporate swag could somehow mitigate the gut-wrenching fact that they had just severed their own lifeline with a lazy, arrogant stroke of a pen. As she walked past her desk for the last time, her fingers brushed against the worn leather spine of a folder. Its edges were softened with age, its pages heavy with her meticulous notes. That folder had been her constant companion through high-stakes drug busts, intense corruption investigations, and countless red-eye flights that blurred into dawn meetings. It wasn't just paper, it was a tangible archive of memory, strategy, and 15 years of painstakingly built relationships that no algorithm or AI could ever hope to replicate. Every page was imbued with something a cold, impersonal police database could never capture: trust. And trust, Sarah knew, had a far longer shelf life than any chief of police. The folder held more than history, it held leverage. Deep within its contents lay the meticulously compiled evidence of 2 of the department's most sensitive ongoing investigations, cases that involved figures far more powerful than the street-level dealers she was typically assigned. These were her whales, as the internal affairs team secretly called them, and their confidential files contained clauses, written in stark black and white, outlining key person dependency. Her name, Sarah Chen, was explicitly spelled out. No Sarah, no continued investigation, no successful prosecution. Such clauses were rare in the cutthroat world of police work, often making high-ranking officials nervous. But Sarah's sources, from deep cover informants to cautious federal agents, had insisted. They hadn't trusted the badge, they trusted her. Chief Thorne, in his infinite arrogance, didn't know this. Or worse, he simply didn't care. He viewed everyone as a number on a spreadsheet, replaceable, scalable, interchangeable. He believed that generic internal memos and glossy departmental webinars could easily supplant the quiet power of a 3 a.m. phone call to a nervous informant like Sparrow, or the handwritten thank you note she'd meticulously crafted after a difficult conviction, always signed personally to show genuine appreciation. He thought the law was merely about signatures. Sarah knew it was about people. Taped to the corner of her monitor, a sticky note had resided there for years. Check section 7.4. She scrawled it late one night after a particularly slimy deputy chief, now Captain Davies, had tried to hijack a major drug bust she'd orchestrated. It was her insurance policy, her quiet little grenade tucked into the fine print of police procedure and informant agreements. That clause was going to matter, far more than any of them realized. A faint smile touched her lips as she saw it. Not the smile one gives a friend, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who understands the story is far from over. As she walked out, the department-crested tote bag swinging innocuously at her side, Officer Jenkins offered that half-sympathetic nod reserved for those who have just lost their livelihood through no fault of their own. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a silent apology. Officer Dale simply stared straight ahead, a wooden sentinel. Her heels echoed sharply, steadily, against the polished tile floor. She didn't look back because she didn't need to. Her mind was already racing, calculating the systematic implosion they had just set in motion. And there would be an implosion. She counted it out in her head like drum beats. 2 weeks until the critical phase of Operation Chimera, her biggest drug ring bust, was due. 3 weeks until the highly sensitive Blue Veil corruption investigation required her direct oversight. Each was anchored to her name. Each was wired directly into that old leather folder they mistakenly believed was replaceable. Here's the thing about unchecked arrogance. It blinds people to the painfully obvious. Chief Thorne believed he had excised dead weight. What he had actually done was light a fuse. By the time her tote bag settled onto the passenger seat of her worn sedan, Sarah already knew precisely how this narrative was going to unfold. 2 weeks wasn't a long time, but in the bureaucratic labyrinth of a police department, it was an eternity. Plenty of time for cracks to widen into irreparable fractures. As the imposing skyline of the precinct headquarters shrank in her rearview mirror, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not anger. Just a profound, cold, clean peace, because she wasn't the one scrambling. They were. They just didn't know it yet. And when her phone began to buzz insistently 2 weeks later, filled with hushed whispers from her few remaining allies inside the department about mounting chaos in the chief's office, she knew it had begun. The slow bleed, the unraveling, the storm building that no one, not even Chief Maxwell Thorne, could stop. They thought firing her had ended the story. It was merely the prologue. The first whisper of the coming storm came from Detective Miller, a friend and trusted colleague still inside the precinct. 2 weeks hadn't even fully passed when her phone lit up with a number Sarah knew by heart. Miller didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sarah," her voice was a strained whisper, as if she were calling from inside a closet. "It's a disaster. Operation Chimera, it just imploded. Legal is panicking. They lost Sparrow, the key informant, and the entire evidence chain for the last 6 months is compromised. Captain Davies is losing his mind." Sarah didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, thick and heavy, until Miller finally added, her voice laced with dawning realization, "It's because of you, isn't it? That key person clause you always insisted on with federal grants and high-risk assets. What did the official notice say, Miller?" Sarah finally asked, her voice calm. "It cited lack of continuity in leadership and insufficient personnel with specialized expertise. But I saw the federal report, Sarah. It explicitly mentioned breach of key personnel agreement, Section 7.4. They knew what would happen if you were removed." Sarah didn't confirm. She didn't have to. Miller knew that Operation Chimera, once fully executed, was projected to be the largest drug bust in the city's history, worth more in federal grants and confiscated assets than half of Chief Thorne's pet community outreach projects combined. Sarah had spent years meticulously weaving that intricate web of informants, evidence, and legal pathways, brick by painstaking brick. Midnight stakeouts, early morning interrogations, last-minute flights to federal facilities to patch over jurisdictional problems before they could escalate. And now, it was gone, dissolving with a single, damning email. Per Section 7.4 of the Confidentiality and Key Personnel Agreement, due to the Key Person Dependency Clause, we are forced to terminate cooperation effective immediately as the named lead detective is no longer with the department. That line was the legal equivalent of a pulled grenade pin. Sarah actually laughed when she read it, a dry, humorless sound. Not from joy, not from spite, but from the sheer, mind-numbing absurdity of it all. Chief Thorne had dismissed her as replaceable, and now, one meticulously crafted clause he'd never bothered to truly read was costing him tens, potentially hundreds, of millions in lost funding, assets, and federal credibility. Inside the precinct, chaos spread like wildfire smoke. Detective Miller, her voice still hushed but with a hint of grim satisfaction, described it perfectly. It's like watching a five-star kitchen catch fire while the head chef insists it's just the oven running a little hot. Chief Thorne just keeps repeating expected churn and strategic pivot to anyone who will listen, but no one's buying it. Chief Thorne, ever the master of corporate doublespeak, tried to soothe the frantic board with buzzwords. Transition pains, he'd declared, expected churn, strategic pivot. But numbers, Sarah knew, didn't bend to buzzwords. Revenue bleeding out wasn't a pivot. It was a gaping, hemorrhaging wound. The Blue Veil corruption investigation was next. Sarah saw it coming, a grim inevitability. Its quarterly review with the Federal Oversight Committee, led by the formidable agent Alina Rodriguez from the FBI, had been her ritual, a rhythm she'd never missed in her 15 years. She didn't even need to call Agent Rodriguez, she already knew. When Chief Thorne's office sent a glossy, generic slide deck and a mass email to the committee instead of her usual detailed, personalized report and direct call, Agent Rodriguez forwarded it to Sarah with just 3 words. "This is insulting. They sent us a generic PowerPoint presentation, Sarah," Agent Rodriguez later told her over a secure line, her voice tight with professional anger. A PowerPoint. For an investigation into a federal racketeering scheme involving elected officials, Thorne had the audacity to suggest we streamline our communication. I informed him that streamlining does not involve removing the only person who understood the labyrinthine connections between the city council and the shipping cartel. His response? He said you were no longer a cultural fit. Unbelievable. Sarah typed a polite reply, short and carefully worded. Per your agreement, Agent, please see Section 7.4. My services are unfortunately no longer available to the department. That was all she needed to say. 2 days later, the federal termination notice for Blue Veil hit the precinct's inbox. $60 million in federal funding for the anti-corruption task force, gone. 2 critical investigations, 2 invaluable networks of informants, 2 key federal partnerships. They weren't just department logos. They were deep personal relationships built on years of trust. Then the calls started. First HR, their voices noticeably less smug. The HR director, Ms. Anya Sharma, usually unflappable, sounded genuinely distressed. Detective Chen, Ms. Sharma began, her voice formal but with a hint of desperation, we've just received a second notice. This is unprecedented. We need you to reconsider. The department's reputation is at stake. My termination wasn't my choice, Ms. Sharma, Sarah replied, her voice firm. Chief Thorne made that decision. I merely adhered to the terms of my contract, as did the federal agencies. Then the chief financial officer, Mr. Richard Vance, called, his tone strained, bordering on panicked. Detective Chen, do you have any idea the financial implications of this? These are colossal losses. We're talking about budget cuts, freezing hiring, perhaps even layoffs. I believe Chief Thorne understood the implications when he signed my termination, Mr. Vance, Sarah retorted. Perhaps he just didn't read the fine print. And finally, Chief Thorne himself. His voice wasn't the smooth, arrogant purr anymore. It was gravel and stale coffee, the kind of raw, desperate tone men adopt when they've been awake too long, staring at the ceiling, watching their empire crumble. You can't do this. He barked before Sarah could even say hello, dispensing with any pretense of professionalism. We'll sue, we'll compel performance. You think you're clever, but you'll be back here in chains if I have to drag you myself. Chief Thorne, Sarah began, her voice quiet, cutting through his tirade. Your threats are noted, but they change nothing. The law is quite clear. The law is what I say it is in this city, he roared, clearly losing control. I will have your badge, your pension, everything. This is insubordination of the highest order. Sarah let him rant. Let him spew threats like bullets into the receiver because she knew something he didn't. The contract, tucked securely in her leather folder, wasn't merely a shield. It was a finely honed sword. Section 7.4 wasn't vague or open to interpretation. It was ironclad. Negotiated years ago, after Captain Davies, then a deputy chief, had tried to cut her out of a major case, she had fought for every single line. Line by painstaking line, until the department's own legal counsel, a cautious and by-the-book man named David Miller, no relation to Detective Miller, had reluctantly admitted, if they sign this, Detective Chen, you're bulletproof. So, Sarah smiled into the silence that followed his tirade and said, her voice unnervingly calm, then let's read the contract together, Chief. He slammed the phone down, but the official invitation came anyway, sliding into her inbox under the stark subject line. Emergency strategy session, mandatory attendance. Sarah accepted, replying with a single, pointed line, "Please confirm external counsel will be present." She wasn't stepping into that lion's den without a lawyer in the room to witness every word she was about to lay bare before them. The night before the meeting, she meticulously spread everything across her dining table. Her original employment agreement, confidential informant contracts, federal task force licenses, performance reviews, email chains, 15 years of ink and signatures. It looked less like mere paperwork and more like a general's map before a decisive battle. She thought about what those papers truly represented. Not revenge, not petty vindictiveness, but proof. Proof that genuine relationships couldn't be commoditized. Proof that loyalty still meant something, even if executives like Chief Thorne failed to recognize its value until it was irretrievably gone. And perhaps, she mused, that was the ultimate message here. People remembered who genuinely showed up for them. At the crisis meeting, at the midnight phone call when their carefully constructed world was teetering on the brink, at the emotionally draining witness protection interviews no one else wanted to handle. That was why the federal agencies and the key informants had walked, not because of a mere clause, but because they intuitively knew Sarah was the one truly in their corner. You couldn't outsource that. You couldn't automate it, and you sure as hell couldn't replace it. When she finally closed the folder, she felt that same clean, unshakable peace again. No adrenaline spike, no trembling hands, just absolute certainty. Tomorrow, they would sit across from her, convinced they were still in control. But the moment their lawyer's eyes landed on Section 7.4, they would grasp the horrifying truth. They hadn't fired her. They had simply handed her the detonator. The boardroom was colder than she remembered. Perhaps it was the HVAC system deliberately set low to maintain a clinical atmosphere. Or perhaps it was the palpable tension that hung heavy in the air, a premonition of the coming storm. When she stepped through the gleaming glass doors, every eye in the room shifted, drawn to her like moths to a flame. Chief Thorne sat at the head of the imposing table, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from granite. A cheap paper cup, rather than his usual polished stainless steel tumbler, held his coffee, a small, telling detail. Men like him didn't deviate from their ingrained habits unless sleep had entirely forsaken them. Captain Davies, the Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs, the very one who'd grinned with barely concealed satisfaction when she was escorted out, was also present. He leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, as if this entire ordeal were merely a theatrical performance, and Sarah, the reluctant entertainment. The HR director, Ms. Anya Sharma, sat rigidly in the corner, nervously flipping through papers she clearly didn't need to flip, a telltale sign of discomfort. The CFO, Mr. Richard Vance, sat beside her, constantly adjusting his tie, his gaze darting between Thorne and the door. And next to the chief sat the department's general counsel, David Miller, his glasses perched low on his nose, his pen tapping a slow, steady, almost hypnotic rhythm against the tabletop. Their external counsel, a stern woman named Ms. Evelyn Reed, sat beside him, her expression unreadable. Sarah carried only 2 items. A slim leather folio containing 3 pristine copies of her employment agreement, and a separate, thicker folder boldly marked in stark black ink. Key person contracts and classified information. She took the seat they'd grudgingly left for her at the far end of the table, her heels clicking precisely against the tile floor. The ubiquitous department tote bag settled gently at her side. She remained calm, silent, radiating the kind of stillness that inexplicably makes other people intensely nervous. Chief Thorne, ever the master of bluster, began with a flourish of aggression. "Detective Chen," he began, his voice laced with an attempt at authority that now sounded strained. "Let's not waste any more time. You've already cost this department 2 major high-profile investigations. That constitutes a clear breach of duty. Our position is simple. You return to assist with these transitions immediately, or we will pursue all available legal remedies. We will not hesitate to compel performance." He uttered compel performance as if it were a threat etched in stone, immutable and absolute. "Chief," Ms. Reed, the external counsel, interjected smoothly, her voice cool and authoritative, "I believe it would be beneficial for us to hear Detective Chen's perspective first, before we discuss legal remedies. Let's ensure all facts are on the table." Her gaze flicked to Thorne, a subtle warning. Sarah didn't argue, she didn't interrupt. She simply unzipped her folio slowly, the quiet sound amplified in the hushed room, and slid 1 copy of her employment agreement towards Chief Thorne, 1 towards the general counsel David Miller, and 1 towards Ms. Reed. Then let's read it together, Chief, she said, her voice even, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. Captain Davies smirked, whispering something snide under his breath to Ms. Sharma. She thinks she's untouchable. Ms. Sharma offered a weak, uncertain smile in return. Chief Thorne ignored Davies, flipping through the pages with the impatient arrogance of someone who fully expected to win purely by volume of threats. David Miller, the general counsel, however, slowed his pace almost immediately. His eyes, sharp and practiced, moved quickly at first, then visibly slowed. His lips pressed tighter, a subtle sign of dawning unease as he reached section 7.4. That was precisely where Sarah had affixed a small, bright yellow sticky flag. David Miller's pen stopped tapping altogether. He read the line again, and again. His lips moved silently, meticulously tracing the words, as if to confirm to himself that he hadn't misread them. Ms. Reed, observing him closely, leaned forward, her own eyes scanning the document. Section 7.4, David Miller murmured, his voice barely audible, confirming the exact text. Upon termination without cause, any client or external agency designated as key person dependent shall have the right to terminate their agreement immediately, with all restrictions on employee solicitation or competition dissolved. He adjusted his glasses, a slow, deliberate movement. Then, his voice dropping another notch, he read the next, more devastating clause. Any attempt to compel post-termination performance from the named key person shall trigger a mandatory buyout equal to 2.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue or projected value of the said key person contract's investigations. His pen fell silent, clattering softly against the table. He looked up, his gaze sweeping from Sarah to Chief Thorne, then finally settling on Ms. Reed, and said nothing. Ms. Reed, her expression still neutral, simply nodded slowly. Sometimes, Sarah thought, silence is the loudest, most damning verdict in the room. Captain Davies scoffed, breaking the heavy quiet. Generous language, no way that holds up in court. This is boilerplate nonsense. It is not boilerplate nonsense, Captain Davies, Ms. Reed interjected, her voice sharp, cutting. It is a legally binding clause that was reviewed and approved by this department's legal counsel at the time of Detective Chen's last renewal. It is quite specific. She then turned her attention back to Sarah. Detective, do you have documentation proving these key person designations? Sarah turned her head slowly, meeting Davies' eyes with an unblinking intensity that made him falter. It's not generous, she stated calmly. It's signed, and yes, Ms. Reed, I do. And then, with deliberate precision, she reached into her separate, thicker folder. From it, she slid out 3 stapled packets, each one bearing official departmental and federal letterheads. Contracts for Operation Chimera, Blue Veil, and Project Phoenix, she announced, her voice resonating with quiet authority. Each packet contained multiple documents, and on each, her name was prominently highlighted in bold under the Key Person Dependency clause. The soft, precise sound of the paper sliding across the polished conference table was almost theatrical. David Miller picked one up, his eyes scanning it rapidly, then letting out the faintest, almost imperceptible exhale. Ms. Reed took another, her brow furrowing slightly as she read. These are enforceable, David Miller stated, his tone low but utterly final. He exchanged a grim look with Ms. Reed, who nodded in agreement. Highly enforceable, Chief, and already triggered. Chief Thorne leaned back in his chair, his shoulders visibly tightening as if he could physically distance himself from the damning words on the page. We never agreed to this level of indemnification, he stammered, his voice weak. You did, Chief, Sarah interjected, her voice still calm, measured, unwavering. You agreed when you signed my contract renewal 3 years ago, the same renewal you never bothered to fully read because you were too preoccupied with rushing off to your golf game. Council approved it. HR filed it. And now, Chief, it is legally binding. Ms. Sharma, the HR director, shuffled her papers again, but this time not to stall. This time, it was clearly to hide the telltale flush creeping up her neck. Mr. Vance, the CFO, closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if bracing for an impact. Sarah let the profound silence stretch, forcing each of them to sit with the crushing weight of their oversight. This isn't about me refusing to help, she added, finally breaking the quiet. It's about the fact that you cannot compel what you do not own. Those federal agencies, those informants, they didn't sign with your department logo. They signed with me. You thought I was replaceable. They, Chief, respectfully disagreed. Captain Davies tried again, his voice louder, more desperate this time. This is extortion. You're holding the department hostage, Chen. This is blackmail. Ms. Reed finally turned to Davies, her gaze as sharp as a scalpel. Captain Davies, she stated, her voice devoid of warmth, calling it extortion or blackmail does not change the legal reality of a signed contract. Your personal opinions are irrelevant in a court of law. She then turned back to Sarah. Detective Chen, based on your knowledge, what is the estimated financial impact of these triggered clauses? The general counsel, David Miller, rubbed his temples. High 7 figures, Chief, he murmured, his voice low but clear enough for the entire table to hear. He looked at Mr. Vance, the CFO. Richard, the numbers. The CFO, Mr. Vance, visibly gulped. Operation Chimera projected federal grants and asset seizures, conservatively $60 million. Blue Veil, another $50 million in federal funding and potential penalties. Project Phoenix, still in its early stages but critical, easily another 15. Multiplied by 2.5, Chief, we're looking at hundreds of millions. It could bankrupt the department's discretionary funds for years. He then turned to Sarah, a desperate plea in his eyes. Detective Chen, surely there's a way we can mitigate this. A negotiation? Sarah folded her hands calmly on the table. Her voice remained utterly serene. This is arithmetic, Mr. Vance, not emotion. You fired me without cause. You broke trust with key federal agencies and informants. Now, the contract simply does what it was designed to do, protect the relationships and the investigations I meticulously built. She tapped the page lightly once. You don't need to like it, Chief. You just need to pay it. No one spoke after that, not for a very long moment. The low, incessant hum of the fluorescent lights filled the suffocating silence, sharp and electric, almost like a buzzing wire about to snap. And in that profound, echoing silence, Sarah knew, with absolute certainty, that the tide had irrevocably turned. The silence in the boardroom was no longer merely polite. It was the kind of deafening quiet that descends when everyone in the room simultaneously realizes the numbers no longer, and perhaps never truly did, work in their favor. It was the moment their carefully constructed house of cards began to sway precariously. David Miller, the general counsel, was the first to break, his composure visibly cracking. He leaned forward, pressing his palm flat against Section 7.4 as if he could physically hold the damning words in place, prevent them from wreaking further havoc. We need precise trailing revenue numbers and projected values for these contracts and investigations, he said quietly, his voice directed not to Sarah, but to the CFO, Mr. Vance. Richard, confirm these figures with the analyst immediately. Mr. Vance didn't argue. He didn't even look up, simply snapping his fingers at the junior analyst who had been hovering nervously by the door. The analyst left in a blur, laptop already open, moving with the frantic urgency of someone who knew they had just been dispatched to fetch the guillotine. Ms. Sharma, the HR director, began fanning herself subtly with a stack of papers. Chief Thorne, ever the blusterer, tried to fill the suffocating gap with noise. This is absurd. Federal agencies don't just walk away from relationships this size over one person. Churn is normal. They'll come back once emotions settle, once we explain the new direction. Sarah let him talk. Let him twist the narrative in his own head, clinging desperately to his false sense of control. Because what he fundamentally failed to grasp was that these relationships weren't mere funnel metrics or easily quantifiable assets. They were living, breathing things built on trust, respect, and tireless effort. And when you insulted them with canned webinars, generic slide decks, and dismissive mass emails, they didn't come back. They simply, definitively, left. The door opened again. The junior analyst, looking even paler than before, whispered numbers urgently into the CFO's ear. Mr. Vance's shoulders slumped visibly, like a man watching his year-end bonus dissolving into thin air right before his very eyes. He scribbled something quickly on a notepad, then slid it with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly towards David Miller. David Miller read it once, then twice. His pen, which had been tapping nervously just moments before, stopped moving altogether. Chief, he said, his voice now flat with grim finality, the estimate stands. Well over $170 million in initial buyout and damages, before any legal fees. He looked at Ms. Reed, who simply raised an eyebrow in confirmation. The air in the room seemed to thin, becoming impossibly heavy. Everyone knew precisely what that meant. It meant financial devastation. Captain Davies was the first to crack, his bluster completely gone. She's bluffing. No way, those clauses are unenforceable. We can tie this up in court for years. No court, Captain Davies, Ms. Reed cut him off sharply, her voice precise and unyielding, would agree. They're enforceable. They were signed, and they've already been triggered. And the department is losing significant federal funding and trust every day this is not resolved. A protracted legal battle would only exacerbate the losses. Captain Davies went quiet, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Chief Thorne leaned back further in his chair, staring up at the ceiling tiles as if they might suddenly offer some miraculous escape hatch. His face was ghastly pale now, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by something closer to profound, gut-wrenching disbelief. And then Sarah spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, each word dropping into the silence like a stone. "You call it absurd, Chief," she began, her gaze sweeping across their stunned faces. "I call it arithmetic. Operation Chimera walked. Blue Veil walked. Project Phoenix, which was dependent on my continued oversight, is also officially withdrawn. That's over $125 million in annual federal funding and projected asset seizures already gone. Add the mandatory buyout, and you're looking at damages that no motivational pep talk or strategic pivot can possibly erase." She paused, letting the staggering numbers settle over them like an immense, crushing weight. But that's not the only arithmetic at play here. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, taking on a dangerous edge. "You've also been using my proprietary investigation materials since my termination. My Lighthouse informant management scripts, my retention frameworks for critical witnesses, my encrypted data analysis protocols, every login to those shared departmental folders has a timestamp. That, Chief, is willful infringement." Ms. Sharma, the HR director, finally spoke again, her voice thin and brittle, barely a whisper. We thought those documents were department property. They were developed on department time. They were licensed, not assigned," Sarah clarified, her voice chillingly precise. She reached into her folder and with a deliberate flourish slid across the most recent license agreement for her proprietary materials. The expiration date was circled in stark red ink. "And the license expired the very day you walked me out. No renewal, no payment. Every single use since then is a clear and actionable breach of intellectual property rights." Which, by the way, means fee shifting applies. "So you don't just pay damages, Chief, you pay my attorney's fees on top of all of this." David Miller read the document, his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "She's right," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. Ms. Reed simply crossed her arms, a look of vindication on her face. Chief Thorne rubbed his temples with both hands, the way people do when a splitting headache transforms into an agonizing migraine. "What do you want?" His voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was utterly, completely tired. That was the precise moment the power shifted, irrevocably and completely. Sarah pulled 2 envelopes from her folio, each labeled in neat, bold black letters. Option A and Option B, she set them side by side on the polished table. "You can open them now or later," she said evenly, her gaze sweeping across their faces, "but the clock, gentlemen, is already running." The CFO, Mr. Vance, stared at the thicker envelope, then quickly looked away, as if its contents were too terrifying to contemplate. David Miller adjusted his glasses, scanning Sarah's face as if to gauge whether she was bluffing. She wasn't. Ms. Reed watched Sarah intently, a glint of respect in her eyes. "Option A," Sarah continued, her voice clear and resonant, "is your narrow escape. You retain me as an independent consultant at $900 an hour, 200 hours minimum, paid in advance. You reinstate the Lighthouse license for 12 months at triple the previous rate. And Captain Davies resigns effective immediately, with a public statement acknowledging his administrative oversight in personnel management." Captain Davies' head snapped toward her, his mouth agape, his face a mixture of fury and shock. "My resignation? You can't be serious. My career." "Your choices led to this, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "My request simply reflects the administrative incompetence that led to these losses." She didn't give him room to interrupt. "Option B," she said, tapping the second envelope lightly, "is cleaner but far bloodier. I decline any further engagement. I join your direct competitor, the Federal Department of Justice's new anti-corruption task force, who, I might add, already has my 3 whales, Operation Chimera, Blue Veil, and Project Phoenix, signed and sealed, awaiting my arrival. You wire the full buyout amount, plus all accrued infringement damages and attorney's fees by Friday at 5:00 p.m. No extensions. No negotiations. No further discussion." And, she added, her eyes meeting Thorne's directly, "the complete, unredacted, encrypted files of all my investigations, including internal corruption probes, that I have securely stored and set to auto-release to major media outlets and federal oversight bodies if I am harmed, detained, or go silent for more than 72 hours, will be handed over to Ms. Reed here, to be released if any further actions are taken against me." A collective gasp went around the table. The insurance policy she'd meticulously built over the years, a digital dead man's switch, was now explicitly on the table. Captain Davies tried again, louder this time. "This is still extortion. You're threatening to expose us." "Captain Davies," Ms. Reed calmly interjected, "the transfer of pre-existing, legally gathered information, especially regarding potential public corruption, is not extortion when tied to a separation agreement. It's a safeguarding measure." And Detective Chen's work, by all accounts, was exceptionally diligent. A public release of such files would undoubtedly be devastating. She tilted her head, meeting Davies' eyes with the calm patience of someone watching a child throw a futile tantrum. Then she turned back to David Miller. "David," Ms. Reed asked, "is it extortion when it's all clearly written in the contract you approved, and when Detective Chen has additional, previously undisclosed, secure information regarding departmental practices?" David Miller didn't look at Captain Davies. He didn't even look at Sarah. He just closed the employment agreement document with a soft, decisive thud and said quietly, his voice hollow, "It's enforceable. And the auto-release mechanism, that would be irreversible. The reputational damage alone would be catastrophic, Chief." The entire room seemed to sag under the crushing weight of those two devastating words and the implicit threat of public exposure. Sarah sat back, folding her hands loosely in her lap. No gloating, no dramatics, just arithmetic, because revenge, she knew, wasn't always loud, explosive, or emotionally charged. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was precise. Sometimes it was merely paper, ironclad signatures, and numbers meticulously written in ink dark enough to bleed through the very fabric of an entire department. And they had just realized the bill was coming due. No one touched the envelopes. David Miller asked for 10 minutes to confer in private. They all stood. Sarah stepped into the hallway, where the air smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant and stale, burnt coffee. Through the tinted glass of the boardroom, she could clearly see Chief Thorne leaning heavily over David Miller's shoulder, while Mr. Vance, the CFO, frantically punched numbers into a calculator that looked far too small for the monumental size of the mistake they had made. Miss Sharma was openly wringing her hands, and Captain Davies looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. Ms. Reed, meanwhile, simply watched them, a cool, calculating observer. When they finally called her back in, Chief Thorne attempted to project an air of neutral authority, but his voice was strained, utterly devoid of its earlier bluster. "Option A with modifications," he announced, his gaze flicking nervously towards Captain Davies, who was now staring fixedly at the table. "Consultant rate reduced to $750 an hour, 100 hours minimum, no advance payment, and no public statement regarding personnel changes for Captain Davies. He will simply be reassigned to a different division."